we are going to talk about code switching and messaging, particularly when it comes to how we are kind of setting up the youth that we work with, the people that we work with, right? How are we helping them? How are we supporting them? And so I am on my own and will be trying my best to keep an eye on the chat, but just in case I miss something, just give me a second, I'll come back to it. All right, so let's go ahead and get started for today. Also, I want you to know I'm keeping my video off because bandwidth issues. So hopefully y'all can hear me and we can just kind of get rocking and rolling today. So can everyone hear or see my screen? Are we good to go? Yes, I got a thumbs up. I'm good to go. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So many chats. First of all, thank y'all so much for coming after our long 3-day weekend. I know that it is sometimes hard to remember that you have to like do anything on the Tuesday after a long 3-day weekend. So thank y'all for coming. Thank y'all for being so talkative in the chat. Please keep that up as I'm going through. If you have any thoughts or ideas or things to add, please put them in the chat. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat as well, and I will do my best to manage all of that. So let's get going. This is the third of 3 of our sessions with Gladney. We're really excited that we've been able to come back. Oh, Nancy also put in the chat that we are recording this, so it will be on the YouTube channel as well. We're really excited to be able to come back and to continue to support and connect with y'all, the adult allies, right? So we like to think of ourselves as allies in our clients' lives. We are there, we're supporting them, we're their assistants. We are here to make sure that they can get to their next step in life, whatever that may be. And so we are excited to come back and to be here with y'all. Our Friends Place is a nonprofit here in Dallas. We have a transitional living center for young women 18 to 24 years old who aren't pregnant or parenting, that go to school and go to work. And then we also have our Sort of Success prevention and education programming, taking life skills and connections to resources, as well as some case management out into the community to work with folks who have experienced homelessness, or even to help prevent youth from having to experience homelessness on their own as well. So we want to make sure that we can connect with those folks. And then also to come and talk to y'all. So those staff, mentors, parents, counselors, teachers, the adult allies, right? Our website is in the chat. It's also on the screen right here. I would be remiss and also probably in trouble if I didn't encourage y'all to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Our Friends Place. Now that I have done that, I can check off that box. So let's keep going. Let's jump into what we're talking about today. So messaging, when I say messaging, what does that mean to y'all? What kind of pops into your mind? What does messaging mean? Go ahead and throw them in the chat. You can either send to hosts and panels or to everyone, but what is messaging in your mind? What does that mean to you? What does it encompass? What does it entail? Outside influence from advertising or social media. Oh, wow. Y'all are just all popping in. An instant conversation, writing, speaking in a certain way, what's being said and also what's being heard. Totally, right? I think that we sending communications to others. Yeah. So for us, I always like to start with a definition, right? Let's make sure we're all on the same page. Somebody wrote spoken and unspoken, right? So it's not always the words, but it is also what else goes in it, right? The tone, all of those pieces. And so for us, what we're going to use is, we actually have 2 definitions, but it's a system or process of transmitting messages, right? That communication. It can be electronic, computer, telephone, television, cable, right? So somebody said social media is also included in that, just the definition hasn't jumped up to present day. For us, it's a communication containing some information, news, advice, request, or the like, sent by a messenger, telephone, email, or other means, right? Messaging is not just the words that are being used, but the medium for the communication, right? So messaging that takes place in person, right? I could say the exact same words, but maybe if I'm texting it to you, you're reading a different tone into that, right? If it's through email, maybe there's even a different tone there, right? We also know that the way that we text with friends should not be the way that we email our boss, right? So we as adults are aware of this. The thing about messaging is that some of our young folks aren't aware of this, right? They don't know that there should be a different way of communicating for different people, right? And that's ultimately what code switching is all about, right? And we'll get into that. But this understanding, this recognition that we have to shift some of the things, the way that we talk, even the medium that we're using for communication, depending on who the audience is, who the other people are, right? So what does messaging encompass? This is that spoken and unspoken, right? It's communication, verbal and nonverbal, right? When we are in person in front of a group of young people, I like to say, I could say, hey, I really like your shoes, or I could say, hey, I really like your shoes, right? And the tone, the way that I change my vocal fry, as the singers in the room will understand, the way that I change my body language, right, changes the actual intent of that message, right? Same words, the intent is different based off of the nonverbal cues that come into it, right? And then also code switching. For us, we're going to look at 4 different pieces of code switching. We're going to talk about power dynamics, hidden rules, registers of language, and then my favorite is transactional analysis. These are things that are incredibly important for us, right, as we continue to move forward. So we're actually going to jump into code switching. Before we do that, I want us again to touch base on that communication piece, the verbal versus nonverbal, right? Because we have to understand that dependent on what else is going on in our lives, sometimes that nonverbal stuff seeps in without us knowing, right? I am reminded of Marina, who has done some of these presentations. She and I, when we first started working together, had some kind of hiccups in our working relationship, because when I get really busy, when I have a lot on my plate, I tend to get way more brisk. I'm way more blunt. And she doesn't. She never gets blunt. She's just always like, let me take all the time to understand. And I'm just like, here's the thing, that's what you need to understand. And I move on. And so she, just because I was busy with outside stuff, with other pieces of my work, she was picking up on that. And actually we had to have a conversation about, like, I'm not upset with you in any way, shape, or form. I just don't have the time, right, to have a full-blown conversation. And so it was one of those things that we had to work through to understand kind of who else is in the room, right? Who else, what the other person is expecting or kind of picking up on that we might not kind of be communicating. And so that was one of the things that we've started doing from that point forward. Is she looks at my calendar first to know what all is going on in my day. But also we talk a lot about, like, hey, I'm super busy right now. Can we have this conversation at a later time? Or, hey, I actually have a lot of downtime right now. Do we want to put in to our schedule to have that kind of deeper dive into whatever piece of our work we need that extra kind of creative juices for? And so we plan kind of around that. The thing about our verbal and nonverbal is that for a lot of the young people that we work with, they don't have the skills or have not had a role model talk through, hey, I'm noticing this nonverbal thing in you. So they just start to take it personally, right? So they are just walking away thinking, oh, she doesn't want to talk to me, I'm not important to her. So, and then there's this wall that is built up that's not real, right? That wasn't intended in any way, shape, or form. And so I think that it's really important for us as allies, as helpers, as support systems, to bring up the nonverbal pieces, right? The nonverbal pieces we know in ourselves, right? When I'm really hungry, I'm probably not going to be like super supportive because I have to eat, right? Or whatever that piece is, right? And being able to say, hey, this is really important. Can I have a snack first? I'm starving, right? And just letting them know that that's a normal thing. It's a normal thing to feel a little bit anxious when you're hungry, right? It's a normal thing to have your nonverbals, to not have control over your nonverbals. And on the flip side, it's important for us to call it out when we see it, right? Not in a harsh calling out, but more of a calling in. Hey, did you notice that when you were talking about that thing the other day that you were really, really just short? It felt like you didn't want to talk about it. It felt like it wasn't important to you. And that's what I picked up from your nonverbals, right? And talking through the difference between those, right? How many times have we had a conversation with a teenager where they've said, I didn't do anything. I just said these words, right? And they'll just repeat the exact words they said. And then our response as adults are like, yes, but you rolled your eyes, your arms were crossed, and the tone that you had was not the best, right? Calling out those nonverbals so that they have a chance to learn from that too. And also making them think through, right? The more that we talk about those nonverbals, ours and theirs, the more that they can start to think through, okay, what are my nonverbals telling people right now? Right? As they age, as their brains develop, they can start to include that in what is my messaging? What am I carrying with me? And so I just think that that's a really important piece. I got off on a soapbox. I'll get back. Okay, so any thoughts, again, put them in the chat. Any additions, any questions, please put those in the chat. So what is code switching? In your mind, what is code switching? What does that mean for you? Again, you can put the answers in the chat. What does code switching mean for you? Shifting communication, my customer service voice, totally. I like to talk about, we have a person on staff with us who in person is very vivacious. You can see her face. Her face tells everything. It betrays her all day. But she gets on the phone and it's the happiest, bubbliest. I'm like, I've never seen you actually bubbly in real life. And that's the same thing for me, right? My customer service voice is so much happier, so much like vivacious, so much more vivacious than I am. Same with my texting voice. I tend to use a lot of exclamations that don't make sense. Changing communication types according to audience, changing the way we communicate. Oh no, I scrolled too fast. Especially depending on the situation, right? With work, friends, interviews, all of those, you kind of have a different hat that you wear. Adjusting the way you speak. It can be the style or the actual language itself, totally. Switching one method of communication to another, depending on who the audience is, totally. So clients, people of my ethnic background, friends, family, all of that, yeah. Changing the way we send our messages as needed, changing communication styles depending on environment, and adapting. I like the adapting my communication style. I like the also within that, the mirroring the other person I'm talking to. So yeah, a little bit of all of that. Spot on. We could end. Please don't stay here. Okay. But yes, totally. So code switching is that, right? Is the process of shifting from one linguistic code, a language or dialect, to another, depending on the social context or conversational setting. It's also the ability to adapt to different audiences, situations, and relationships by changing the way we communicate, the words we use, the way we hold ourselves, or even our tone of voice. And then we have those examples, right? Our phone voice, communicating a message to a friend's child versus your own child. I like to think about my nephew. He's 10 years old. The way that I talk to my nephew versus a friend's kid or one of his friends, right? That I don't know as well. Sometimes I have to use more words. My own nephew and I kind of have our own little language that we use. And we have our own way of kind of playing and joking that a kid that I don't know wouldn't know, right? They're not kind of in that group with us. The way that you talk to your boss versus the way that you're talking to your best friend, right? All of those are shifting and different. I even like to think of a little bit deeper, right? Because I think that we think about, well, the way that I talk to my friends versus the way that I talk to my coworkers. But sometimes you have a coworker who kind of blurs that line and is also your friend outside of work. But sometimes you have a best friend and then you have like acquaintance friends, right? People you know, and the way that you talk to them is very different. The way that I talk to, I have two older sisters. The way that I talk to each of them is a little bit different. And then when the three of us are together, that communication style is different, right? And we can kind of think about how that is different. And then when mom shows up, we shift our communication style again, right? Because there are different people in the group. And that means that the group dynamics shift, right? And that's what code switching is, right? Is recognizing that because of the different people in that group or that audience, right? That the communication style must shift in order to include those people, right? As well as in order to make sure that you're safe and secure, right? Not everybody needs to know all your business. Not everybody needs to have that access to those different parts of your personality, right? I like to tell the young people that we're working with, not everybody deserves to know that, right? Not everybody deserves to know everything about you. Not everybody deserves to see all aspects of your personality, right? So what aspects of your personality are more for those people who are really close to you, right, in your deepest inner circle? And what aspects of your personality do you want to protect so that those people who haven't proven that they deserve to be in that inner circle, they don't get to see those, right? What does that look like? So when do we already do code switching? We've talked a little bit about this, right? When we're talking about this with young people, we actually have a sheet that has all the different roles that they play in their lives, right? Maybe you're a parent, a child, you have a job, maybe you're a leader, community member, church member, neighbor, friend, sibling, cousin, whatever that may be. And then we like to say, like, who do you interact with in that group? And then how do you interact with those people in that group? Because it's a little bit different, right? We all act a little different in each of those roles. And maybe even then when we add in new people, we act a little bit different as well. It's not that you're a different person. I like to think of it as stereo knobs. When I show this picture to young people, they're like, what is that? And then I feel old. And I'm not that old. They're just, they're mean with their honesty. It's fine. In certain situations, you turn the treble up or down, right? The bass up or down, you turn the volume up or down, you mute certain things, right? And you mix that sound differently. You're still the same person, right? You're still the same stereo, but your knobs or different parts of your personality take center stage in different situations. And that's code switching. And it can be really tricky to know what to turn up and what to turn down. I always talk about how I'm actually very much an introvert. I don't thoroughly enjoy being around a lot of people that I don't know. But also my job is to give presentations to groups of people, right? And so I still have that part of my personality that I can turn on, that I can communicate with and have conversations with strangers and do these sorts of things. It's just not the thing that I enjoy the most, right? That's not something I would choose to do in my daily life, but it is something that I've chosen to do at work, right? And so different parts of my personality take different center stage based off of what I'm doing. So this is kind of code switching in a kind of general stance, right? What I will also say is I think somebody mentioned in the chat that it also depends on your own ethnic group, right? Who you're coming from, right? Who raised you, who you've been around your whole life, not just family, but also the cultures that are a part of different ethnicities. And when we talk about code switching, I would be remiss if I didn't also talk about the recognition that our business banking school systems are based off of middle-class white norms, which means that a lot of folks who are people of color, right, that they have had to do code switching in order to be successful in business banking education, whether or not they were raised in middle class, because it's also built off of those white social norms. And so recognizing that for a lot of the youth of color that we work with, code switching totally makes sense. They can think about all of the things that, and sometimes the things that they've been told that they need to do when they're out in public, right, by their parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles. Because again, in order to succeed in those areas, you have to be aware that there is that shift and shift in dynamic. I think last week we were also, this also might have been at a different presentation, but in a presentation last week, there was a conversation about in school settings, because we were working with teachers at the time, that there is a culture for students and then a culture for staff, right? And I think that when that was discussed by a youth we were at a conference last week at that conference, I started to think about there is a culture for the clients we serve and a culture for the staff that is serving or supporting them too, that are very different things, right? So also recognizing that not just in one place is there one culture or one dynamic happening, that there's often multiple different cultures interacting and dynamics switching up too. So recognizing that. Okay, so let's jump into how do we code switch. We have power dynamics, hidden rules, registers of language, and transactional analysis. So power dynamics, right? Power dynamics are the way different people or different groups of people interact with each other, where one of these sides is more powerful than the other, right? And power dynamics is really broken into, I think, 3 different categories. The first is personal power, right? So recognizing your own power. Us on this group, we are support systems, we are allies, we are helpers, and the fact that we are there to help them means that they need help and we do not, right? There is an inherent power in being the helper, right? Versus being the helpee. We also like to talk about how do you dress, right? As a part of our job on our non-residential side, we go out into the community. We're going into high schools. And when we go into those high schools dressed in business to business casual, we're automatically putting ourselves in a different position than them, right? We're saying, hey, not only do I have a job that requires me to dress this way, but also I have the money to pay for clothes like this, right? And that's not to say that you shouldn't, right? We do our best to dress down when we're going to be in a school so that we are breaking down that barrier as best we can. But there are times when we can't, right? There are times when there's still a dress code at work that we have to fit into, or there's an event after work that we have to go to. And so when that is the case, we just call it out, right? Recognizing that there is a personal power inherent in how we dress, that we can just pull out and say, hey, you know what? I don't normally dress like this. I don't like dressing like this. This is how I have to dress for this event. Or even sometimes, I got this on sale at this place. So if you ever have to dress up for a job or for a job interview, I encourage you to go to that place because you can get stuff that is really nice looking for cheap, right? Again, kind of bringing in the fact that it's not all about like, look at all of my brand name things, but also how can they attain that so that there isn't this like, I'm better than you inherent. Again, that societal privilege. We live in a society in which this is an accurate fact, right? If you're white, male, cisgendered, middle class to upper middle class to wealthy, if you are over the age of 18, you have certain privileges that come with you, right? So checking that societal privilege, what does that look like? And just recognizing that when you walk into the room, right? Especially when you are working with young people who, if they are under the age of 18, they don't have a whole lot of autonomy to make choices of their own. They can't choose where they live, typically. They can't rent on their own. They can't even sometimes work enough hours to be able to do all the things that are necessary for their own lives. Sometimes they have younger siblings or young kids themselves that they are also taking care of, right? So recognizing the societal privilege that comes from just being an adult, having a job, right? Those sorts of pieces, but also if you're working with people who are living in poverty and you yourself are not living in poverty, there is a socioeconomic status privilege that comes with that. If you're cisgendered and you're working with folks who are trans, if you are male and you're working with women, right? If you are white and you're working with people of color, that there is a difference there. That doesn't mean you can't work with them. It just means that you have to recognize the privilege that comes with that. And also then kind of take that into account when you are suggesting things for them to do, right? Well, if it was me, I would blah, 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 blah. You aren't them, right? And so instead of saying, especially for a young person who has a lot of adults telling them what to do anyway, one of the most important things that we talk about a lot is defeating adultism, right? I know because I'm alive and I've lived longer than you because here I am older, right? And instead of you should do, or if it were me, I would do, right? Having the conversation of, what are your thoughts on how to solve this problem, right? Really leading with that Socratic method. What are your thoughts? Asking all the questions. And then, well, if you did X, what do you think would come from that, right? What are the potential consequences, positive or negative? If you do Y, what are the potential positives and negative consequences, right? And talking them through kind of the pro-con list, right? I think what often happens with young people is they are told what they should do, but not led through the thinking process that helps them then determine what to do later on in life when you're not there with them, right? And so instead of, again, when you recognize that you have certain societal privileges that just exist in the world, instead of giving them what they should do, could do, must do, talking them through what they think they should, could, must do, right? And helping them work through what that looks like for them. And then also recognizing that a part of personal power is also that you may have the power to take something from them, right? You may have the power to take freedom or housing or access or education or friends from them. And even if you don't wield that power, even if you've never wielded that power before, just the recognition that you could creates a barrier for those people that you're serving, right? Just that you might creates that barrier. Another piece of this personal power dynamic that comes into play is also you are probably not the only person there to, quote, help them, end quote, right? Which means that if somebody before you has wielded that power, if they have had a negative interaction with a helper before you, that baggage now is something they carry into the relationship with you, and they may not think that you are actually there for them, right? And so just being aware of, it's not always about you, right? It's not always about the fact that you wouldn't do that. You would never do that. That's not something I would do, right? If they've experienced somebody in the past who's done that, they are more likely to just assume anyone will, right? That's a part of the survival response that we have is, look, it smells like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it's probably a duck, right? You have that power to do those things, maybe even to require me to do something. Other people have made me do that. I have to assume that you're going to make me do that too, right? Which is where also a lot of overstating your expectations, over communicating who you are, where you're from, what your goals are in the support system that you are helping to create for them. And just really, if you can't do something, don't promise it, right? Those sorts of pieces. That is where I think a lot of people have issues and concerns, is because they're like, well, I'm not that person. Doesn't matter if you're that person. They know that person. They've worked with that person before. And so you have to be so much not that person to be able to help them. So again, just kind of being aware of those things. Again, if there are any thoughts, any responses, please put them in the chat. Another personal dynamic that I think is really important to talk about is office structure. There's been a lot of research into how you set up, if you are in an office or have a desk or whatever that is that people come to for help. There's a ton of research in how can you be more welcoming, how can you be more open, how can you be more of a support for folks, versus how can you make them feel like they are the bad kid who got called into the principal's office, right? Kind of that mentality, right? And so for your office structure and policies, do you sit behind a desk? Have you created a physical barrier between you and that other person, right? Do they physically know that they're on the other side because you've created a side unwittingly, unintentionally? I try my hardest to set my office up to where there is no other side of the desk, that I turn my desk or my chair around, or I pull a chair to the side of my desk so that we can talk. I also know that there are some policies and just safety things that might not be something that your office can do. And so with that, maybe the question becomes, do you try to make it less overbearing, right? Do you have fidget toys? Do you have snacks? Are you the safe place to come? right? Do you have the blaring, glaring overhead lights, or do you have some lamps around so it feels more welcoming? The fidget toys, Marina likes to talk about, it's not enough just to have the fidget toys. When there is a youth that comes in and is sitting in a space and talking with her, she always grabs a fidget toy first. There's a lot to be said for the human ability to mirror. So if you take a fidget toy, I'm more likely to take a fidget toy and play with it too, because we as humans mirror one another a lot. And so the more that you can control kind of your body language, the better off they can mirror what you're doing as well. And so those fidget toys, the snacks, my favorite thing is when a young person just stops by to grab a snack. They aren't here to talk to me about any big, terrible, hard thing. They just wanted a snack. And in that moment that they're grabbing a snack, I can be like, hey, how are you doing? What's going on? And then they'll give me a little snippet, or I can be like, hey, last week you had a really big test. How did that go? So that they can again see me as somebody who not only has the snack and is a safe place to come and grab a snack, but is also somebody who just remembers things about them. Somebody put in the chat that they have their desk facing the door. So when students are in my office, I can turn around and face the rest of the room without the barrier of the desk. Totally, right? And then that also puts you kind of in that safe place. If you need to leave, if you need to exit, you can, right? You're closest to the door. Or if you need to close that door really quickly, you're right there to close that door so that that student can talk about those really hard things, whatever they came in to talk to you about. Totally. Having that ability to turn around and not have a physical barrier is really helpful, especially for students who are just looking for that support, right? All they want is somebody to see them for who they are. And if I'm behind the desk, you only see what you see on Zoom, right? So how can you see me for who I am? Just taking that barrier down is really helpful. Also, do you make them look at you? Man, I still, when I'm having a hard conversation with somebody, don't necessarily want to stare them in the eye. And I hate it when people stare me directly into my eyes. It feels like you're looking into my soul, and now I'm scared. And so one of the things is what we recognize as humans is sometimes when things are really difficult, we're going to look at our hands in our lap. We're going to be moving our hands a lot. We're going to be looking up at the ceiling. We're going to be looking all around and darting all around. Maybe we're going to be pacing back and forth, right? Because we're dealing with a lot. And if we as adults do that, we also have to recognize that teenagers or young people are also going to do that, right? Because they are also developing what those skills are. If you make them stop and look you in the eye, that may actually stop their train of thought. That may actually stop them from being able to tell you what they came to tell you, because they're fearful of what your face may tell them. They're fearful of what their face may tell you, right? And so when you stop them and make them look at you to talk, it's really is kind of, again, it feels like you're being really open, like, hey, look at me. But what you're really doing is taking them out of where their brain is, right? There's a ton of research into some of the best times to talk to someone is when you're walking next to them, right? When your eyes aren't on theirs, their eyes aren't on you. Nobody's looking at each other. You're facing forward, walking along next to each other, because the more that you're moving, right, and the more that you aren't staring at one another, the more open people can be. There are a ton of play therapists that will, and again, the research goes into this, that the more you're playing with something, right, those fidget toys, the Play-Doh, whatever it is, the more people open up because they aren't having to worry about your response or your reaction. And then finally, again, also when we talk about office structure, are there policies in place that make their lives harder, right? Is there a way for for young people to speak their mind without getting in trouble, right? One of my favorite examples is sometimes when we're angry, we use words that we shouldn't use, right? In polite company. And typically as adults, we've learned to curb that so that when we're angry at work, when we're frustrated at work, when we are having those hard emotions at work, we are also usually managing the words that we're using, right? And also our nonverbals. And then when we get home or when we're on a call with our best friend on our drive home, we're using all the words right? We're doing all the things, right? We didn't come out from like 2 years old knowing how to manage those things, right? We've all seen the toddler having the throwdown, right? We've all experienced having to be with a toddler having a throwdown, probably, right? In the middle of a store, there it is, right? Probably because they're hungry and they're tired and all of the other things are going on, right? And as they get older, as we all get older, we learn to manage, right? When I am angry about something I shouldn't be angry with, the first question I ask is, am I hungry? Right? I've learned I probably need to eat something when I am angry like that. I am the Snickers commercial, right? But also recognizing that sometimes when young people are getting older and they're learning all of the words and then they get really angry or frustrated, sometimes they just start cussing. Sometimes they're yelling because they haven't learned how to manage those emotions and code switch from place to place, right? Now, if we have a policy that says as soon as the student is yelling, as soon as the student is cussing, that's it, get out of my classroom, move on, right? That A doesn't teach them how to handle that differently, right, in the future, but also B doesn't take into account that they're just learning how to communicate the problems that they're having. And also they're communicating to you in the first place, right? I think that we have a lot of like deficit thinking. Oh, they're yelling, they're cussing, they're doing all of these things versus the strength-based thinking, which is, man, they're talking. How lucky am I to be the person that they're talking to? They're talking to in a very angry tone with lots of words. But just because a kid is yelling and cussing doesn't mean that they're violent. That just means that they're angry and upset, right? And so trying to think through what policies could you have that you could pull that student aside, right? That maybe they do need a break, right? They need a moment, but then how can we go back to it afterwards and say, okay, what was going on? What got you to that level? Let's talk about that, right? Helping them to learn how to communicate, and then also following up with, hey, in the future, yelling and cussing isn't helpful in this situation. It helps you to get all of your emotions out, right? But when you are in a public place, when you are in a school, when you are in business, when you are at work, that is not the way that you need to communicate your frustration, because it will get you fired, right? It will lead to some negative consequences, right? But talking to them after that, right? Giving them the chance to really feel their feelings and talking to them after that. But what other policies might make their lives more difficult, right? Might be creating barriers. I also think about like at schools and having a set dress code where they have to wear a set polo depending on what, whatever the color is, depending on their school year, school grade. And recognizing that policy makes students' lives harder, right? That infers that they have the money to pay for that. And what are the recourses, right? If a student is getting in trouble because they're wearing the wrong color polo over and over again, is the question being asked, do you have access to this? And is it being asked in a non-judgmental kind way, right? Or is it why don't you have a polo that is your right color, right? Again, recognizing that there is a whole world of that student that you might not ever get to know if you don't ask the right questions. Okay, we gotta go. Okay, so power dynamics and messaging. Again, I think I mentioned this earlier, telling versus recommending, right? Even if it is you should do, right, in your mind, you need to do this, right? That is very telling. And I don't know about y'all, but I still have this innate thing in me that's like, I'm not going to do the thing you told me to do. And teenagers have that even worse, right? It is stronger versus recommending, right? Like, hey, I don't know if this will work for you. I know that this has worked for other students. I think it might be helpful if you, right? And then instead of saying you should do, right? If you do this, right? Couching it in a recommendation, following up with, do you think that would work for you, right? Why or why not? And let's dig deeper into what your solution is. We're going to get into some policing things here. Respect policing, right? The choice to not listen to what somebody is telling you because you don't feel respected, right? In and of itself is a power choice, right? It's saying, I have the power not to listen to you. I have the power not to help you because I don't like the way you're talking to me. I don't like that I feel disrespected, right? And like I said earlier, if a student is in your room cussing and yelling and it's just the two of you, man, listen to them, right? Listen to them. Just give them a chance. And then at a certain point, when they've tuckered themselves out, because we all do, say, hey, can we sit down and talk about this? Right? I want to know more about what's going on, but I need you not to yell at me so that I can really understand what's going on, right? Not right at the beginning be like, hey, you're being really disrespectful. If you don't start being more respectful, I'm going to kick you out of my room, right? That does nothing for anyone. You don't understand where they're coming from. They feel like you're not a safe person anymore, when in fact, the simple fact that they are yelling at you, yelling in your general vicinity, means that you are someone that they feel safe talking to, right? And so making sure that not only are we giving them the chance to talk through, but then following up afterwards, right? After we've listened to them, after we've had the conversation, to say, hey, I don't really like the way that you started talking to me. I am glad that we've had a chance to really talk. But then when you sat down and you just started opening up and telling me what was going on versus the yelling that was happening before, that's when we got to find a solution, right? And so, hey, in the future, I want you to know that if you're yelling, if you're cussing, there are a lot of teachers, there are a lot of bosses that will just make you go away, right? Will dismiss you out of hand, will not listen to you if that's the way that you're approaching. So how else can we approach, right? That recommending. How else can you approach in the future? The same thing with language policing. Sometimes we don't like the words that they're using. Sometimes those words aren't appropriate for the setting that we're in, and that's fine, right? That's true. That's real. I can't just roll into the office and start cussing people. I will get in trouble. And that is a learning moment for young people too, right? To learn that. We like to think that they should already know these things, but who has taught them and how do they know those things? And in what world do we think that they've just picked up these pieces of information here and there, right? They're coming to us, they're in our vicinity for us to help them be successful, which means if they're acting in a certain way that's not going to help them be successful, it is our job, right? It is our responsibility. We are the people in the room to pull them aside and say, hey, this isn't going to work in the future, right? We need to nip that in the bud and stop doing that. Tone policing is one of the worst things that anyone could ever possibly do. I feel this very deeply as somebody who's been told to calm down more than once. When I am very frustrated and upset and you tell me to calm down, it has the opposite effect. It has the absolute opposite effect on me, and it has the absolute opposite effect on anyone, right? My favorite is when I'm told to calm down after I think I'm being calm, because I've already calmed myself down before I started talking to you. And so when we don't listen to somebody because we don't like their tone of voice, because we don't like the way that their body language is showing us, right? Their crossed arms, their rolled eyes, their neck rolls, whatever that is that they're doing, right? When we don't like the tone of what is coming at us and therefore we aren't listening to their message, we are telling them straight up, I refuse to listen to you, period. And again, this isn't always something that we can control when we're upset. And I will also say that for people of color and women, especially, tone policing is something that comes at us on a regular basis. And so recognizing that there is also an inherent, not just power dynamic and power structure in that, but that there's also societal power dynamics involved in tone policing as well, which is something that we just need to break away from, right? And so again, just like with language and respect, hearing somebody out, talking through with them. Like I said earlier, we as human beings from the very earliest age, from tiny little babies, we learn to mirror what the other person is giving us. Tiny little babies smile for the first time because they've been smiled at so consistently that they're mirroring that facial expression. That is it, period. It's not because they're happy. It's not because all of those other pieces go into it. They are mirroring what you are showing them. And then they think, oh, smile means happy, because when this person is happy and has that feeling, then they smile. And that means that when I am happy, I should smile too. It is a mirroring thing. It is a mirroring thing, the way that kids talk, right? How many times have you said a word and then just had a kid repeat that word over and over again when they're in the toddler stages and learning how to talk, right? This is why moms and dads, right, whoever happens to be the one who says it the most, that's the word that the kid uses, right? Mama, dada. It's just because you've said it so many times that they're mirroring that word for the first time. My sister's first word was tea, because we always had sweet tea in the household. It had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that she loved tea above all other things. It just happened to be the word she heard the most and could put her mouth around, right? We mirror, right? And that is how we learn how to do things. We mirror. We watch somebody else, we say, okay, I can do that. And so when it comes to tone, language, respect, when somebody is communicating in a way that you feel is disrespectful, is using language that shouldn't be there, is using tone that you don't like, control your own response, right? Calm yourself down, make sure you're regulated and using language that's appropriate, because they will start to mirror you, right? If you then, if they're being disrespectful and you respond with disrespect, that just heightens, right? If they're being disrespectful and you respond with respect, they mirror. If they're using language you don't enjoy and you're using different language, they mirror. If they're using tones that are a tone that isn't appropriate and you use the tone that is appropriate, they mirror. That is how we learn how to communicate and how we learn to have relationships. So the most important thing is to manage yourself, because it manages what then they respond with. It is kind of like magic. Also, there is a piece where, and I don't know if we get to it later on, I can't remember, but having a bottle of water and taking a drink and putting a bottle in front of them. When you take a drink, they typically will take a drink. When you take a drink, they'll typically take a drink. And there's a lot of research that goes into when we are frustrated, when we are in a heightened emotional state, when we are feeling in our survival, right? Our survival response coming in, the more water we drink, right? The more that dilutes those endorphins that are flooding our system, the more likely we are to actually be calm, and not just calm outwardly, but also internally. So again, finding ways to help them mirror calm, respectful communication, right? Even when frustrated. Recommendation, again, be that bridge, right? If you want to be a leader, you must be a bridge, right? So if you are on one side and they are on the other side, you feel like they're being disrespectful, the language they're using, the tone they're using, whatever it is completely the antithesis of what you think is appropriate or what is appropriate for the area that you're in. Be that bridge to help them walk over to your side, right? I think so often we break that bridge down entirely, and now we are just on the opposite side of this really wide gulf, right? But when we build that bridge, when we help them walk us across that bridge, when we help them learn how to better communicate in the future, the shorter and shorter that bridge becomes over time. And so I just think that's a really important piece for us to remember as well. So hidden rules. Hidden rules are the unspoken cues and habits of a group. They are unsaid, unseen forces that tell a newcomer that they don't belong yet and have some things to learn before they are accepted into the group. Every group has hidden rules. It doesn't matter what the group is. Every group has hidden rules. Think about the first time you walked into a new school, church, or job, and the feeling that everyone else seemed to know how to act, what to say, where to sit, and how to belong. Even the way that you talk when you're out with your friends versus how you talk with your grandmother at work or at church. We all have hidden rules. Every single group. Your school has hidden rules. The student community or the client community has a different hidden rule than the staff or support staff community has. It is inherent. It is one of those things Marina likes to talk about. On her first day, we had a staff meeting and we all sit in the exact same seats. We don't have like placards with our names on them. This isn't something that is like well known out there. Everybody sees it. My back is always to the windows. That's where I sit. And then Nicole sits next to me. And then this is how the whole room looks, right? On Marina's first day, she sat down in a seat and we all said, that's not your seat. That's Janae's seat. That's where she's going to sit. That is where she always sits. And she laughed it off thinking that we were joking, which, you know, that makes sense, knowing her personality. And what happened was when Janae came in, she looked at her like she wanted her dead because that was her seat. And how dare you, new person, sit in my seat? And in that moment, Marina knew that she had done a bad thing because she sat in someone's wrong seat. And that is a hidden rule, right? It's not stated anywhere that that's Janae's seat. It's not stated anywhere that we have a seating chart for work meetings. It's just how it happens to function. And when we try to communicate it, right, because it's not written, because it didn't feel real, Marina automatically knew that, oh, I'm the new person here and I've made a mistake, right? And we've all been in that position. We've all been in the position where you're at a new job, you walk into a new classroom, whatever it is, and it's like, oh no, everybody else seems to know what they're doing here, and I have absolutely no idea. We also like to talk about with the young people we work with, right? If you're working in a job where you have multiple different managers, shift managers, that you know which shift manager everybody likes. You know which shift manager is more likely to give you a day off when you ask for it. You know which one to go to. You know which shift manager you have to be minding your P's and Q's on. But a new person doesn't, right? And with those hidden rules, right, it's either I sit back and I watch and I try and figure it out, which is what a lot of young people do, right? But for those of us who have the understanding, it's incumbent upon us to help bring those hidden rules out, right? To state the unstated, to put them out there so that there is no kind of hidden agenda or question in their mind of what exists, right? And we've all grown up with hidden rules of our communities, families, cultures, and groups. So not only small groups within, but also those larger groups too. I like to think about, again, I mentioned earlier, the way that I talk with my sisters is very different than the way that I talk with if my mom joins the group or if my cousins are there, right? Like we all have different ways of communicating. We also all have different hidden rules that are a part of it. As we learn and move into different phases of life, we have to be aware that there are new hidden rules and find ways to master them in order to survive, right? We have had the chance to experience what it feels like to walk into a place where there are hidden rules. We've also had the chance to learn how to deal with that. A lot of the young people we work with have not. I am reminded, we talked about hidden rules with a young woman who, growing up, she had moved a lot. And so she had moved from place to place to place to place. And when we talked about hidden rules, she said, I never realized that the reason why I didn't have a lot of friends growing up is because I never even thought that there were different rules at play. I didn't think about that these people might interact differently than the last group of people at the last school that I was in. I just thought school is school and everybody acts the same. And so for her, there was this big aha of like, this is why I have issues at work. This is why I have issues with my roommates. This is why these things keep happening, because I never even thought that there might be something else happening. Like I just thought people didn't like me. And for her, that was a really big aha for her. For me, it was a little bit of a heartbreak, because that means that nobody sat her down and said, hey, you know what? It's not that you're a bad person or that you're wrong or that there's anything inherently wrong with you. It's just that you're in a different culture and a different community, and each culture and community has a different set of hidden rules. And so being able to have her talk through that, then she was able to work through some of the issues that she was having with her roommates and with her boss and with her coworkers, because she was, instead of just being kind of what she thought was always normal, right? She started recognizing, okay, wait, I actually have the chance that I can turn down certain parts of my knobs, right? That I don't have to be on full blast at all times. That there are times when I don't need to tell everybody everything, right? That I can't. So she started learning the code switching and the hidden rules that were at play too, which is really helpful for her. Again, no hidden rules are better than the other. This isn't a hierarchy. They're just tools in your toolbox. So when we talk to young people about this, it's important that we recognize that the hidden rules that you've grown up with, those are really important. The hidden rules of your family, of your community, of your culture, of your friend group, those are important for you to know. It doesn't mean nothing is better or worse than the other. They're just tools in your toolbox that help you to be successful. And so how can we put more tools in that toolbox, right? Mastering those new hidden rules gives you the opportunity to develop more groups and connections while still holding on to those older groups, right, that have always been there for you, that you've always known. And then also hidden rules help you to shed your privilege to connect with those in your programs in a more authentic and genuine way. Because again, hidden rules aren't just for the people we're supporting and helping. They're also for us to recognize that the way that we interact with the world is based off of our hidden rules, right? They're based off of the things that we know and understand, not the things that the youth or young people that we're working with know and understand. Which means that the things that we find important and valuable are not necessarily the same things they find important and valuable. And that's a really important piece to remember. So hidden rules of youth and adults. This is something that we put some research into, and we just kind of wanted to have a conversation around with y'all. So as you'll see, there's a column for youth, there's a column for adults, and these different rows or categories, right? For youth, money is to be spent, it's to be used, right? It's to be, money comes in, they've made a paycheck, they don't care about saving, they don't care about all those other things. It's what can I spend my money on, right? For adults, we manage it. For youth, social emphasis is on the people they like, whereas for adults is on self-governance and self-sufficiency. So for adults, there's a lot of, why are you doing that? You don't even really seem to like those things that you're doing, right? And the youth is like, yeah, but I like the people. The people are important. My friend was doing it. My best friend said that this would be really cool. I didn't like it, but that's what she said it was going to be. So I did it, right? That social emphasis on those people, right? The other people are important. Because again, what we know about youth is their brains are developing. And as a part of that, as a part of the adolescent brain development is this kind of more reliance on my peers for what I should or shouldn't be doing versus a reliance on myself to think through what I should or shouldn't be doing. And again, this is super generalization, right? There are some adults that are still very much like that. And there are some youth that are very much like, I don't really care what anybody else is doing. I'm just going to do my own thing, right? But in generalizations, for youth, the present is most important when it comes to time. Decisions are made for this moment based on feelings or survival. And for adults, the future is most important, right? How is the choices I'm going to make right now? How are they going to impact me in a year, 2 years, 5 years, right? Or even thinking through, like, I am saving for this big purchase later on, or I want to own a house by a certain time, right? Adults will say that, and they have plans working toward that. For youth, it's like, yeah, I want to be a lawyer and I want to be a doctor, and I also want to own a house, and I want to have 4 cars, and I want to, and all of that is really fun dreams, but they aren't planning toward that just yet because they're still focused on the present time, right? And that makes good sense. That's where they are. And also, they can't truly make decisions that impact that future, right? How are they supposed to save if they don't have access to a savings account or access to knowledge of how to save, right? How are they supposed to know what to save or how much to save? Education for youth, it's valued and revered. They're not right now, for our youth right now, they're not willing to put their financial futures in jeopardy for their education, for post-secondary education. For adults, we have always been told, especially as millennials, that education is crucial for climbing the success ladder and for making money. And so therefore it's worth it, right? That's what we've been told, except for those of us who have student loans still. And then we're questioning whether or not that's true. For youth, the casual register is the language that is most often used. Beyond that, it's also pop culture references. They TikTok speak on a regular basis. I'm like, wait, you're just quoting TikToks now? That's great. Does that mean something? Okay, fantastic. For adults, we recognize, especially those of us who have jobs and we are working in a profession of some sort, that the formal register is what helps us to communicate with one another. This is something that we do on a regular basis, but I would also argue that when we are just around our friends or our family, we slide directly into that casual register and maybe even use some TikTok references on a regular basis too. For youth, they see the world in terms of a local setting, what's around me, but also that what is around me also includes the TikTok, right? And those sorts of things, right? Whereas for adults, we recognize that the choices we make can affect us on a national setting. That's a typo. For youth, love and acceptance is conditional based upon whether an individual is liked, whereas for adults, it's really based upon achievement, which is just, again, there's not a hierarchy here. It's not a good or a bad, it's just a different. For youth, those driving forces are survival, relationships, entertainment. Whereas for adults, our driving forces are work and achievement, right? I need to keep working. I need to keep my job. I need to get a paycheck so that I can pay my bills, so that I can feed myself and my kids, so that I can do all the things that I need to do. For youth, they're just not at that level of life yet, right? They aren't at that place. This also means that when we as adults are talking about the importance of not falling into what the crowd is doing and following your own mind and thinking about your future and all of those pieces that come into it, for youth, they're like, yeah, that's cool for you. Their brain's just not there yet, right? And so as helpers, as support systems, it's our role to figure out how can we communicate that, right? The importance of self-governance and self-sufficiency, right? On or into words and actions that youth understand, right? How can we communicate the importance of getting a job, having a paycheck, right? To youth who at this point don't necessarily find that as impactful, right? And so I think that this is one of those things that's really helpful in recognizing that the way we communicate to youth is based off of our hidden rules and what is needed for our lives as adults in a working profession. That isn't necessarily true for youth in young adults. So hidden rules and messaging. Hidden rules are hidden because they aren't communicated, right? They aren't written and they often aren't talked about. So the recommendation that we always tell folks is talk about them, right? Is also assume that when a misstep takes place, it's because they didn't know that there was a hidden rule, not because they were just trying to push the boundaries or they were just trying to be agitators or whatever we as adults often think about youth, right? But just kind of assuming that they just didn't know, right? And so instead of, hey, stop doing that, don't do that, you know better, right? Instead of ever assuming that someone knows better, pulling them aside and saying, hey, I don't know if you knew this, right? But the way that you're talking or the way that you're acting, it's going to be a problem, right? It's going to be a bigger issue the more it happens. So let's talk about those hidden rules that exist, right? I also like to just write them down. So as a hidden rule comes up, keeping a 3M post-it note. As a hidden rule happens, let's write it up, right? So we know that during class time, during a lecture or whatever, we're not supposed to have our phones out. Let's write that down, right? We assume that they know, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but if it's written down, then they can't say that they didn't, right? Also point them out as they're happening. Remember to be that bridge to help them recognize that they aren't wrong or bad for not knowing something that hasn't been explained yet, right? That also is for us to remember that that person isn't wrong or bad or whatever other negative word we want to give them for not knowing something that hasn't been explained, right? And I always just assume if I haven't said something to someone, then they probably haven't learned it before or heard it before. So I just make sure I'm the one who says it to them, right? So I can know. And also so I can point back, hey, remember when we had this conversation, right? And then also stop seeing anything as common sense. Nothing is common sense. Common to whom? Common to you, right? Because you've experienced it, you've seen it, so it makes sense to you. It does not mean that other people have seen it or experienced it as well. before we jump into, because we have a few minutes, are there any thoughts or responses to either the hidden rules or the power dynamics conversations that we've had so far? Put them in the chat. Thoughts, responses, additional things that you want to bring up in the conversation, or even questions that you might have. While you're doing that, I'm going to take a drink of water. Anything stick out to you, something you want to remember, or something that you're already doing that would be helpful for other people to know? Somebody said that they appreciate the language around explaining that every environment has different expectations. And to me, that's huge, right? That recognizing that different environments have different expectations, but also having the conversation around that, especially for young people who haven't had to experience that or had that opportunity to know that yet, right, is very helpful. And just having that added language, right, beyond just the layer of just race, right, because there is difference, right, amongst different races and ethnicities, but also recognizing that it's not just that is a major component, but there's a lot other pieces too. So thank you for putting that in the chat as well. Any other thoughts? Speaking of hidden kind of rules or hidden messages, it would be really nice if like chat, similar to how the text does on phones, with the 3 little dots that lets you know somebody is typing. That would be helpful on a Zoom, just in case the Zoom people are listening in. Okay, so we're going to keep moving on, but please keep putting things in the chat and I'll pull them up as I see them. So I want to talk about registers of language, right? Registers of language, it's a variety of language used for a particular purpose or in a particular communicative situation, right? There is a power in which register you use in different circumstances and with different people. I really enjoy this little image of the little blue dude saying blah, blah, and then the yellow dude being like, what is happening? What do you mean? Because I think often that's what happens with registers of language is we walk in to a situation using a register that we're really comfortable using, not recognizing that the audience is uncomfortable using that register, right? And it can be for a variety of different reasons. So I know that you probably have seen the registers of language before, I assume, but also I don't want to have this be a hidden rule. So let's pull it all out, right? So there are 5 different registers of language. We have our frozen register, which is the language that is always the same. For example, right, the Lord's Prayer, wedding vows, the Pledge of Allegiance, etc. Right, and when things shift, when somebody misses a word, everyone knows, right? Everyone in that room feels it, hears it, notices, because frozen language is always the same no matter what, right? So that's also why we can memorize it really easily, right? It's always the same. If you've ever watched Law and Order, ever, if you've watched maybe more than 5, then you probably know the Miranda rights because they always say it the exact same way, right? That's frozen language. Formal register is the standard sentence syntax and word choice of work and school, right? Has complete sentences and specific word choices. This is subject, verb, agreement, right? And then adjectives, all of those things, right? Direct object, all of those pieces are that formal sentence syntax that comes in. This is what we expect to hear in speeches. This is what we expect to hear in written form, read in written form, in papers, right, that are submitted to teachers. This is what we expect in work in school, is the formal register of language. Consultative is the formal register, but in conversation, right? It's that ping pong discourse pattern. You say something, I say something. It's in complete sentences, right? You use a complete sentence or question. I respond with a complete sentence or question, right? That formal register, but kind of in a ping pong style, or tennis, whichever makes good sense in your head. Then we have casual register, right? And what we talked about with youth is that youth tend to live in the casual register. This is the language between friends, characterized by only 400 to 800 word vocabulary, because the word choice is usually very general, not specific, mostly because it is dependent upon nonverbal assists, right? If you think about it with your friends, how many times have you been sitting with a friend and something has happened, right? A situation has happened, and you haven't even needed to use words. You just used your eyes, and somehow your friend knows exactly what's going on, right? I think about my best friend and the amount of times that we have cracked up over one of us having a facial expression in response to something else that the other one just automatically knows, right? Because of the years that we've known each other, all of that comes up, and now we're just giggling. So yes, so that is often where our youth are sitting, right? Is nonverbal assists, not a ton of words being used, right? Which means that when we are asking them to speak in the formal without having an understanding of why that is necessary in those different areas, that becomes really difficult, right? And then we have intimate, which is the language between lovers or twins or people that you know really well, right? This is also the language of sexual harassment, right? Because each of these registers is dependent on who your audience is, right? And if I am using intimate language with somebody that I don't know very well, that is where sexual harassment takes place, right? And so recognizing that there's a time and place for each of these, and that it depends on what the situation is. What we know is, let me click over, sorry. That hidden rules, just a reminder that formal is typically used in the middle class. It's also typically used in adults, right? Because middle class, white social middle class rules, right, are built into education and work environments, right? Which means that for those of us who have matriculated through a work environment or a school environment and are now in a work environment, formal is something that as adults is very normal and natural to us. Casual is also typically used in poverty, but is also used very much in youth because it's relationship oriented, right? And so when we think about language, tone, respect, policing, and we're recognizing that casual language, what is often used by youth, right, is based on the language, right? Not just the language, but also your facial expressions, your nonverbal assists. That as adults, it's important for us to help our youth recognize that the casual register is great in certain situations, but in other situations, formal is necessary, and formal needs to be something that we jump into, right? And again, building that toolbox. Again, how do we meet them where they are and remove that power barrier when possible, right? Instead of telling them they're wrong or bad for using a casual register in conversation with you, talking them through why casual register might not get them where they need to be, right? Might not be success or leading them to success in the future. I want to call attention to the chat that I just want to read this out loud because I think it's an important conversation piece. I wish cultural competencies as far as hidden rules would have been touched on more. Code switching from white provider to white client is so much more simple, than white provider to person of color client. It's not a judgment call on you, thank you, at all, but I think it would be unethical to not mention that hidden biases and cultural incompetencies and the ability to not understand how another race or culture is communicating plays a huge role in racism in the medical, social work, and psychiatric fields. I completely agree. Thank you for calling attention to that and pulling that out. Because I Totally. And that is one of the things that I think is really important too, that each of us as individuals, an hour and a half long session isn't enough for us to call out each of those things, right? What are those hidden biases? What are those cultural incompetencies that are just existing in this world that we live in, right? That are then becoming those hidden biases that we each have, right? It's not enough to do an hour and a half. That is something that each of us has to dig and then also jump into other presentations on, right? Because as an individual, I need to first know where my hidden biases are and also do some research and understanding and have conversations with people about how do I, right? How do I come across? What are the things that are just inherent in me that I'm not seeing or not noticing? But a lot of that has to do not just trainings that you sit on, but also individual work that you are constantly doing too. When it comes to racial equity, recognizing that the societal soup that we live in, right, those white social norms, the white supremacy that is seeped into every single organizational structure that exists. But then also, how does that inform the hidden biases that you have? Because we each have them. So thank you for pulling that out, because I completely agree. And I just wanted to make sure that we touched on that too. So thank you for that. I think this is the last topic we're going to talk about, is transactional analysis. I really appreciate transactional analysis because it does give us kind of another way to think about the way that we communicate with one another and the interchange that we have. So transactional analysis is a system of psychology that's based on the ideas that my behavior and social relationships are based off of an interchange between the parental, critical and nurturing, adult, rational, and childlike, intuitive, independent aspects of personality that are established really early in life. This is something that we talk about with young people all the time, because what we find is that when it comes to a lot of conflict that people are having, whether it's between friends or between other people, right? Your boss, your teacher, whatever that may be, that often it comes down to, how are you controlling yourself in the situation? We talk about this with adults, clearly with y'all as well, because I think that this is something that it's important for us to remember what we're doing. And so for just the interest of time, for transactional analysis, you have a parent, you have a child, you have an adult. Each of us have all three of these voices, right? Each of us, even a young kid, a tiny little 5-6-year-old. When I think back to my nephew being 6 or 7, I can remember him having a parent voice at different times. So this isn't based off of your age. This isn't based off of who you are or where you are in your life. Each of us have all three of these. So the parent voice is very authoritative, directive, judgmental, evaluative, has a win-lose mentality, is very demanding, punitive, and sometimes threatening. It sounds like you shouldn't, or you should do this. It's wrong to, that's stupid, that's mature, that's immature, that's ridiculous. You're worthless, you're good, you're bad, any judgmental, evaluative comment that you're making about someone else, right? But then also, if you weren't so this, then this wouldn't happen to you, right? If you weren't so talkative, then you wouldn't be getting in trouble. If you weren't so outgoing, then you wouldn't have to handle or have to talk to all these different people that you know, right? Like, it is that evaluative kind of thought process that exists, whether positive or negative, right? Whether building people up or tearing people down. It's I am making a judgment about you. And from my perspective, right? That is the parent voice that we each have. Then we also have a child voice. We have defensive, victimized, emotional, whining, a losing attitude, strongly negative, and nonverbal. It's really hard to say these without getting into the voice, so I'm sorry, but like, quit picking on me. You don't love me. Nobody likes me. It's your fault. You made me do it, right? Each of those is very much like, I am not responsible for my actions, right? You're doing this to me. Just stop. If you just stop, then I wouldn't act like this, right? Very whiny. And then we also have an adult voice, right? We have a non-judgmental, free of negative, nonverbals, factual, often in question format, in an attitude of win-win. We're both going to win on this conversational style, right? So it has a lot of questions involved, right? In what way could this be resolved? I'd like to recommend you kind of try this. Do you think that would work for you? Uh, you know what? Let's just agree to disagree right now. We can come back to this at a later point, right? Where are the choices in this situation? What can you change if you need to? Or even just stating like, I am uncomfortable with the way that this conversation is going. Can we change some of the ways that we're talking to each other, right? What is important to remember about transactional analysis is that we have a choice in which voice we use, right? But also, if we're not taking that choice, we will just jump into what is natural for us, right? So for some of us, when somebody comes at us very defensive or victimized or emotional in that child voice, for some of us, it is our natural tendency to jump into parent voice, right? Well, quit picking on me. Well, you shouldn't have done that in the first place, right? And now we are into a transactional analysis in which one person is a child and one person is a parent while you're both seemingly adults, right? Some of us, it is our natural tendency when somebody is coming at us with a child voice to respond in a child voice, right? Like, well, it's your fault. It's not my fault. If you weren't here, then this wouldn't have happened, right? Then why did you do it? You did it too. It's not my fault. You made me do it, right? Child voice all over the place. And some people respond to parent with a parent, right? Well, you shouldn't have done that. Well, then you shouldn't have done this. Okay. You shouldn't have been so stupid to do that. Well, then you shouldn't have done, right? In all of those scenarios, if there's a conflict involved, the conflict rages, right? Because when somebody responds with a parent voice to a child, the conflict just continues, right? And maybe it dies down because nobody is talking about it now, but it's never resolved. When two child voices are interacting with one another, that conflict is never resolved either, right? It just kind of devolves. And when two parent voices are responding to one another with authoritative, judgmental responses, that conflict rages, right? But when we choose to take a break, when we choose to take a step back and respond with an adult voice, it often diffuses a conflict situation. It doesn't always, right? The other person might not want to. The other person may just be looking for a conflict, which totally makes sense because we as humans sometimes do that. But when we respond with an adult voice, using questions, really trying to seek to understand, right? Trying to be non-judgmental, then often what happens is, remember I was talking about mirroring earlier, that we as humans are taught to mirror, that then they start to mirror that too often, right? And so when somebody is being very stuck in child voice, responding with a, hey, what's going on here? I just want to know more what's happening here. I'd like to understand so that I can help, right? That often then that person stops being that defensive, victimized, whining voice, right? And switches into a more calm, communicative style. It's not like it's a switch overnight, boom, we're here to go, right? Sometimes you have to ask a few questions. Sometimes, again, you have to regulate yourself and control yourself as best you can in your communication style. But what you see is they start picking up on that too, and they start to shift. So moving on. Again, how does your choice of voice impact their reactions? This is something, again, to think through. Is the way that I chose to respond, did that lead to increased conflict? Or did it lead to open and reflective communication, right? And so recognizing, what can you do here? I was in a situation where I was at a tabling event at a local college, and had for our friend's place, and I had been working here for maybe a month or so at that point, and a young woman had come up, and she was just really frustrated. It was clear that she was just really upset about what had happened when she was in our housing program. I didn't know her. I had never heard of her. I didn't even really know how our housing program worked because I'd only been here for a month and I don't work in our housing program. So at the time I didn't fully know. But she was yelling, she was screaming, she was standing over me because I was sitting down at the table waiting for other students to come and talk to them. And so I just really calmly stood up And as soon as she had kind of calmed down a little bit, taken a breath, honestly, she was breathing, ready to come back at me. I just said, hey, it's clear that you're really upset. I would really like to know more of what's going on. I don't know a ton, but I'd love to know more. Can we have a conversation? She stared at me and then just like ran away, because she wasn't ready to have a conversation. And I get that. But she expected a response that she didn't get and didn't know how to then calm herself and soothe herself into a position where she could talk. Later on, we ended up having a conversation and resolved it. But at the time, she just wasn't ready. So she just walked away and left me standing there. I didn't yell at her. I didn't tell her she was wrong. I didn't tell her, hey, this isn't the place for this conversation. I just sought to understand more of what was causing her to have this frustration. And she just wasn't able to communicate at that point. So she left. She came back later and we had a conversation when she was at a place where she could think it through. But that's how transactional analysis works, right? People expect a certain response, especially if that is what they're used to getting when they come at you judgmental or directive, or when they come at you with a defensive tone, right? They are used to getting a certain response. And when you choose, right, and when you take a beat, you take those 3 seconds to calm down and then you respond, it gives them a chance to kind of see that there's a different way to communicate. And either they rise to that occasion or they come back later after they had a chance to think it through. So it's a really interesting way of communicating and recognizing kind of where you are. I always try and remind myself to not be parent or child. I'm more likely to be in parent voice than I am child voice. That is my natural inclination. And so recognizing that I need to pull myself aside and have a little pep talk. So how do you control your voice to allow for more open communication? That 3-second rule, letting them speak their truth, right? And giving them those 3 seconds, just a pause, so that you can think about how you are going to respond, right? We have act, don't react. Reacting is without thinking, responding, right? Responding is I have thought about it and I know what I am doing and I'm going to respond in a way that I feel comfortable with, right? So just some reminders as we are closing out for code switching, checking your power dynamics. What is at play? Who are you? Who are you and what are you bringing into the situation? Your hidden rules, being mindful of the hidden rules at play, and remembering to be that bridge, right? Not telling them that they are wrong for being on the opposite side, but talking them through how they can better interact to be more successful in their lives for whatever they want in their life. Also remembering that there's no such thing as common sense, even if it's something that you really deeply feel everyone should know. That doesn't mean that everyone has had an opportunity to know that, or that piece of information is helpful in everyone's life either, right? So again, recognizing common sense serves those people who know, but not necessarily those who don't. The registers of language can lead to a power imbalance and enforcing that power, right? And so recognizing that is another area in which power dynamics can be at play. And then for transactional analysis, act, not react, right? Choose your response instead of jumping to what is your natural inclination. With that, are there any questions or responses, comments about code switching and messaging?